The ramp was modest, nothing dramatic. It was a clean, professionally built wooden ramp that ran along the side of the front steps, painted to match the house, with a non-slip surface and proper handrails on both sides. The contractor finished it in a day and a half. My mother cried when she walked down it the first time without holding onto anything. That was a Thursday. The fine letter arrived the following Monday. At first glance, I thought it was a mistake. The letter was from the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association, and it informed me that the structure recently added to the exterior of my property was in violation of Section 4, Paragraph 11 of the community's architectural guidelines, which required prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee for any modification to the exterior of a home. Because no such approval had been sought or granted, I was being assessed a fine of $200 per day until the structure was removed or properly approved. The letter was signed by one Gerald Hutchins, president of the Maplewood Estates HOA board. $200 per day for a wheelchair ramp for my elderly, disabled mother. By this point, the fines had already accumulated to over $1,200 and were climbing every single day. I felt the particular suffocating pressure of watching a number grow while being completely powerless to stop it through any normal channel. I thought about just tearing the ramp down, submitting the paperwork retroactively, and waiting for approval. But that would have meant my mother, once again, could not safely access her own home. I could not do it. It was my cousin Danielle who changed everything. Danielle, who had spent the last 11 years practicing civil rights and housing law. Danielle, who I had called purely to vent over the phone one evening after another day of watching that fine counter tick upward. I had barely finished describing the situation when she went completely quiet for a long moment, and then said 3 words I was not expecting. She said, "They broke federal law." Danielle walked me through it that night, slowly and clearly. The Fair Housing Act, as amended in 1988, explicitly prohibits housing associations, HOAs included, from refusing to allow a person with a disability to make reasonable modifications to their home necessary for that person to fully enjoy the premises. Not modifications that are cosmetically invisible, not modifications that cost under a certain threshold. Reasonable modifications, full stop. A wheelchair ramp for a mobility-impaired resident is not an ambiguous case. It is, according to decades of federal case law, exactly what the Fair Housing Act was designed to protect. Gerald Hutchins and the Maplewood Estates HOA had not just been unreasonable. They had walked directly into the center of a federal statute and planted their flag there. Danielle told me she wanted to take the case. She told me she would not charge me a dime in legal fees. And then she told me something else, something that made me realize this was no longer just about my mother's ramp. She told me that if the HOA had done this to us, there was almost certainly a pattern of discriminatory enforcement against other disabled residents in the community, and that a pattern like that had serious implications far beyond a single fine reversal. We filed the federal complaint on a Wednesday. I remember the exact day because it was raining, and I sat in Danielle's car in the parking lot outside the federal courthouse watching the rain streak down the windshield, thinking about how different everything felt from 3 weeks ago when I had been staring at that first fine letter in disbelief. The complaint named the Maplewood Estates HOA, the management company that administered it, and Gerald Hutchins personally. It alleged violations of the Fair Housing Act, sought reversal of all assessed fines, recovery of legal fees, and damages. It also notified the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which had its own investigative authority. Gerald Hutchins received his copy of the complaint 2 days later. I was told by someone who lived next door to him that he stood at his mailbox for a very long time that afternoon, reading it in the rain. The board called an emergency meeting that same weekend. I was not invited, but the outcome of that meeting would determine whether they were about to learn the hardest lesson of their collective lives. They chose wrong, and everything that happened next changed the entire neighborhood forever. The Maplewood Estates HOA board met that weekend with their own attorney, a man named Frederick Coles who had represented HOAs and property management companies across the county for 15 years. By all accounts, Frederick Coles was confident. He had navigated dozens of disputes, mediated hundreds of complaints, and settled more architectural violation arguments than he could probably count. He told the board, according to what we later learned during the discovery process, that this was manageable, that the complaint would likely be dismissed or settled quietly, that they should not capitulate, because doing so would set a precedent that would open the floodgates to similar requests from every resident who wanted to modify their home without going through proper channels. What Frederick Coles did not appear to account for was Danielle. While the HOA was busy convincing themselves this was a routine property dispute, Danielle had already begun building something far more significant than a single case. She sent formal records requests to the HOA management company, pulling every architectural review decision made over the past 7 years. What she found inside those records was precisely what she had suspected. There were at least 9 other instances where residents had requested accessibility modifications, grab bars, widened doorways, entrance modifications, and had either been denied outright, buried in procedural delays, or fined for proceeding without approval. In 4 of those cases, the modifications had eventually been quietly permitted after the resident gave up fighting and simply reapplied. In 2 other cases, elderly residents had removed the modifications entirely under financial pressure from the fines. This was no longer a single violation. This was a documented pattern of systematic discrimination against disabled residents spanning nearly a decade. Danielle filed an amended complaint with HUD, attaching the records and a formal request for a full investigation into the HOA's architectural review practices. HUD opened an investigation within 3 weeks. That was when the tone from the other side changed completely. Frederick Coles stopped sending letters full of confident legal posturing. The HOA management company requested a mediation call. Gerald Hutchins, who had not communicated with me directly since the first appeal denial, sent a letter to Danielle's office that described itself as an attempt at good faith resolution. Danielle responded by expanding the list of what we were seeking. We were no longer simply asking for the fines to be reversed. We were asking for a complete audit of every architectural decision made in the past 10 years. We were asking for the board to adopt a written accessibility accommodation policy, approved by a fair housing attorney and distributed to every resident. We were asking for the HOA to fund the construction of an accessible common area pathway connecting the community's main sidewalk to the park and recreation center that had, for years, been effectively unreachable for residents who used mobility aids. And we were asking for the HOA to cover every dollar of our legal fees, because not a single part of this fight should have been necessary. The HOA's attorney filed a formal objection to the expanded demands within the week. But something was happening inside the community itself that was far harder to manage than a legal filing. Word had gotten out. Several of the residents who had previously been denied accessibility modifications were now in contact with Danielle's office. 2 of them had agreed to submit supporting statements to HUD's investigation. One of them, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret who used a power wheelchair, agreed to speak publicly about being fined for installing a threshold ramp at her back door 3 years earlier. Her story was picked up by a local news station. The HOA board held another emergency meeting. This one, by multiple accounts, was significantly louder than the first. The settlement came 11 weeks after we filed the original complaint. It was comprehensive. Every fine that had been assessed against my mother's property, which had by that point accumulated to over $17,000 due to the daily rate continuing through the litigation period, was reversed in full. The HOA paid our entire legal bill. They funded the accessible pathway through the community recreation area, a project that had been on resident wish lists for years and had somehow never found room in the budget until a federal investigation materialized. Gerald Hutchins resigned from the board within 2 weeks of the settlement. 3 other board members followed him by the end of the month. The day the new pathway was completed, my mother walked the length of it in her own mobility aid, all the way from the sidewalk to the park bench she had not been able to reach in 4 years. She sat there for a long time in the afternoon sun. She did not say much about it afterward. She did not need to. Here is what this story is really about, and I want you to hear this clearly. This was not about a ramp. It was not even really about one arrogant HOA board and their $200 a day power trip. It was about the fact that the law, when you know it and use it correctly, is a remarkable equalizer. Gerald Hutchins and his board were so confident in the authority of their little rulebook that they never once stopped to consider whether their rulebook was legal. It was not, and that ignorance cost them everything. If you are watching this and you are dealing with an HOA, a landlord, a neighbor, or anyone who is using rules and fines and bureaucratic pressure to push you around, do your research. Know your rights. The Fair Housing Act exists. Federal law exists, and sometimes the person on the other side of that fine letter has no idea what they have just walked into. If this story hit different for you, drop a comment below with the word ramp and tell me about a time someone underestimated you. Like this video if you believe nobody should have to fight this hard just to take care of their family. Subscribe because there are 10 more stories just like this one already waiting for you. And I will see you in the next one.